Hello. I am back to read another book. And let me turn this lamp around because it's way too bright. Then much better. The book that I'm reading is, let's see if we can see it up here, The Sign of the Beaver. It is written by Elizabeth George Spear. And like I said, I picked this book. I originally picked The Long Winter, which I don't think was a good choice. So I'm opting out one. So I'm going to read this one to you. This is the story. I'll read you the synopsis on the back. Until the day his father returned to their cabin in Maine wilderness, 12-year-old Matt must try to survive on his own. Although Matt is brave, he's not prepared for an attack of swarming bees, and he's astonished when he's rescued by an Indian chief and his grandson, Attain. So it's a story about a kid who has to survive. And I think that's what we're all doing right now is surviving. So I'm going to read this book. I think it might take a little bit longer than the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but not much because it's not an awfully big, thick book. So let me get my tea situated. How's everybody doing? I sent out a bunch of texts and emails today to your parents so that we can get this distance learning going. If you have access to Study Island, I have a lesson on Study Island. If you do not have access to Study Island, there is a paper and pencil lesson that is a journal, which I think is actually the more interesting assignment. And you could do either one. Even if you have a computer, you could still do the journal. I'm going to try to figure out a way to put it on Facebook and Instagram, and I might call some of you and say, please help me put this on Instagram. All right, so chapter 1. Matt stood at the edge of the clearing for some time after his father had gone out of sight among the trees. There was just a chance that his father might turn back, that perhaps he had forgotten something or had some last word of advice. This was the one time Matt reckoned he wouldn't mind the advice, no matter how many times he'd heard it before. But finally, he had to admit that this was not going to happen. His father had really gone. He was alone with miles of wilderness stretching on every side. He turned and looked at the log house. It was a fair house, he thought. His mother would have no cause to be ashamed of it. He had helped to build every inch of it. He had helped to cut down the spruce trees and haul the logs and square and notch them. He had stood at one end of every log and raised it, one on top of the other, fitting the notched ends together as snugly as if they had grown that way. He had climbed the roof to fasten down the cedar splints with long poles and dragged up pine boughs to cover them. Behind the cabin, there were mounds of corn he had helped to plant and green blades already shooting up. The pumpkin vines were just showing between the stumps of trees. If only it were not so quiet. He had been alone before. His father had often gone into the forest to hunt for hours on end. Even when he was there, he was not much of a talker. Sometimes they had worked side by side through a whole morning without his speaking a single word. But this silence was different. It coiled around Matt and reached into his stomach to settle there in a hard knot. He knew it was high time his father was starting back. That was part of the plan that the family had worked out together in the long winter of 1768, sitting by lamplight around the pine table in Massachusetts. His father had spread out the surveyor's map and traced the boundaries of the land he had purchased in Maine territory. They would be the first settlers in a new township. In the spring, when the ice melted, Matt and his father would travel north. They would take passage on a ship to the settlement at the mouth of the Penobscot River. There they would find some man with a boat to take them up the river, and then on a smaller river that branched from it, many days' distance from the settlement. Finally, they would strike out on foot into the forest and claim their own plot of land. They would clear a patch of ground, build a cabin, and plant some corn. In the summer, his father would go back to Massachusetts to fetch his mother and sister and the new baby, who would be born while they were gone. Matt would stay behind and guard the cabin and the corn patch. It hadn't been quite so easy as it sounded back at their house in Quincy. Matt had to get used to going to sleep every night with every muscle in his body aching, but the log house was finished. It had only one room. Before winter, they would add a loft for him and his sister to sleep in. Inside, there were shelves along one wall and a sturdy table with two stools. One of these days, his father promised, he would cut out a window and fasten oiled paper to let in light. Someday, the paper would be replaced with real glass. Against the chimney was a wall of smaller logs, daubed and lined with clay from the creek. This, too, was a temporary structure. Over and over, his father had warned Matt that it wasn't as safe as a stone chimney and they had to watch out for flying sparks. He needn't fear. After all the work of building this house, Matt wasn't going to let it burn down about his ears. 6 weeks, his father had said that morning, maybe 7. Hard to reckon exactly with your ma and sister. We'll have to be going slow, especially with a new little one. We may lose track of the weeks, he added. Easy to do when you're alone. Might as well make notches on a stick. 7 notches to a stick. Then you get the 7th stick, you start looking for us. A silly thing to do, Matt thought, as though he couldn't count the weeks for himself. But he wouldn't argue, not on that last morning. Then his father reached up to a chink in the log wall and took down a battered tin box that held his watch, his compass, and a few silver coins. He took out the big silver watch. Every time you cut a notch, he said, remember to wind this up at the same time. Matt took the watch in his hand as gently as if it were a bird's egg. You aim to leave it, Pa? He asked. It belonged to your grandpa. It would have belonged to you anyhow, sooner or later. Might as well be now. You mean it's mine? It's yourn. Be kind of company hearing it tick. The lump in Matt's throat felt as big as the watch. This was the finest thing his father had ever possessed. I'll take care of it, he managed. I know you would. Mind you don't wind it up too tight. Then, just before he left, his father had given him a second gift. Thinking of it, Matt walked back into the cabin and looked up at his father's rifle, hanging on 2 pegs over the door. I'll take your old blunderbuss with me, his father said. This one aims truer, but mind you, don't go banging away at everything that moves. Wait till you're dead sure. There's plenty of powder if you don't waste it. It was the first sign he had given that he felt uneasy about leaving Matt here alone. Matt wished now that he could have said something to reassure his father instead of standing there tongue-tied. But if he had any chance, he knew he wouldn't do any better. They just weren't a family to put things into words. He reached up and took down the rifle. It was lighter than his old matchlock, the one his father had carried with him in exchange. This was a fine piece. The walnut stock was as smooth and shining as his mother's silk dress. It was a mite long, but it had good balance. With this gun, he wouldn't need to waste powder, so it wouldn't hurt to take one shot right now just to try the feel of it. He knew his father always kept that rifle as clean as a new polished spoon. But because he enjoyed handling it, Matt poked about in the touch hole with the metal pick. From the powder horn, he shook a little of the black powder into the pan. Then he took one lead bullet out of the pouch, wrapped it in a patch of cloth, and rammed it into the barrel. As he worked, he whistled loudly in the stillness. It made the knot in his stomach loosen a little. As he stepped into the woods, a blue jay screeched warning, so it was some time before he spotted anything to shoot at. Presently, he saw a red squirrel hunched on a branch, with its tail curled up behind its ears. He lifted the rifle, sighted along the barrel, minding his father's good advice and waiting until he was dead sure. The feel of the shot delighted him. It didn't set him back on his heels like the old matchlock. Still, he hadn't quite got the hang of it. He caught the flick of a tail as the squirrel scampered to an upper branch. I could do better with my own gun, he thought. The rifle of his father's was going to take some getting used to. Ruefully, he trudged back to the cabin. For his noon meal, he sat munching a bit of johnny cake his father had baked that morning. Already, he was beginning to realize that time was going to move very slowly. A whole afternoon to go before he could cut that first notch. 7 sticks. That would be August. He would have a birthday before August. He supposed his father had forgotten that with so many things on his mind. By the time his family got back, he would be 13 years old. Chapter 2. By the next morning, the tight place in his stomach was gone. By the morning after that, Matt decided it was a mighty pleasant living alone. He enjoyed waking to a day stretched out before him to fill as he pleased. He would set himself the necessary chores without having to listen to any advice about how they should be done. He could have thought that the time would move more slowly. As the days passed and he cut one notch after another on his stick, Matt discovered that there was never enough time for all that he must do between sunrise and sunset. Although the cabin was finished, his father had left him the endless task of chinking the space between the logs with clay at the creek bank. On the edge of the clearing, there were trees to fell to let in more sun on the growing corn and underbrush that kept creeping over the cleared ground. All of this provided plenty of wood to be chopped and stacked in the woodpile against the cabin wall. To cook a meal for himself once or twice a day, he had to keep the fire going. Twice in the first days, he had woken and found the ashes cold. Back in Quincy, if his mother's fire burned out, she sent him or Sarah with a shovel to borrow a live coal from a neighbor. There was no neighbor here. He had to gather twigs and make a wad of shredded cedar bark, then strike his flint and blow on the tiny spark until it burst into flame. A man could get mighty hungry before he coaxed that spark into a cooking fire. The corn patch needed constant tending. In these hot, bright days, every drop of water that those green shoots demanded had to be lugged from the creek, a kettleful at a time, and there was no way to water the corn without encouraging the weeds as well. As fast as he pulled them, new ones sprang up. The crows drove him distracted, forever flapping about. A dozen times a day he would dash at them fiercely, shouting and waving his arms. They would just fly lazily off and wait on a nearby treetop till his back was turned. He dared not waste his precious powder on them. At night, wild creatures nibbled the tops of the green shoots. Once he sat up all night with his rifle across his knees, batting at the mosquitoes. When morning came, he stumbled into the cabin and slept away half the day. That was the second time he let the fire go out. He seemed to be hungrier than ever before in his life. The barrel of flour was going down almost as fast as when two were dipping into it. He depended on his gun to keep his stomach filled. He was still proud of that gun, but no longer in awe of it. Carrying it over his shoulder, he set out confidently into the forest, venturing farther each day, certain of bringing home a duck or a rabbit for his dinner. For a change of diet, he could take his fish pole and follow the twisting course of the creek or walk the trail his father had blazed to a pond some distance away. In no time, he would catch all the fish he could eat. Twice he glimpsed a deer moving through the trees just out of range of his rifle. One of these days, he promised himself, he would bring one down. It was a good life, with only a few small annoyances buzzing like mosquitoes inside his head. One of these was the thought of Indians. Not that he feared them. His father had been assured by the proprietors that this new settlement would be safe. Since the last treaty with the tribes, there had not been an attack reported anywhere in this part of Maine. Still, one could not forget all of those terrible tales. He just didn't like the feeling he had sometimes that someone was watching him. He couldn't prove it. He could never see anything more than a quick shadow that might be a moving branch, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was there. One of those pieces of advice that his father had been so fond of giving had been about the Indians. They won't bother you, he said. Most of them had left for Canada. The ones who stayed don't want to make any trouble. They take a great pride in their politeness, and should you speak to one, speak to him just the same as if the minister came to visit. Matt had seen his father follow his own advice. Once when they tramped a long way from the cabin, they had seen in the distance a solitary, dark-skinned figure. The two men nodded at each other, lifted a hand in salute, exactly as if they had been two deacons passing in the town square. But how could you be respectful to a shadow that would not show itself? It made Matt uneasy. He had grown used to the stillness. In fact, he knew now that the forest was rarely quiet. As he tramped through, he, as he tramped through the forest, he was accompanied by the chirping of birds, the chatter of squirrels, and the whine and twang of thousands of bothersome insects. In the night, he could recognize how the strange sounds that used to startle him, the grunt of a porcupine rummaging in the garden, the boom of a great horned owl, the scream of some small creature pounced on in the forest, or the long wavering cry of a loon from the distant pond. The first time he had heard that loon call, he thought it was a wolf. Now he liked to hear it. Mournful as it was the cry of another living creature. Matt could worm his shoulder into a comfortable spot in the hemlock boughs that made his mattress and pull the blanket over his head and shut out the mosquitoes and fall asleep well satisfied with this world. He would have liked, however, to occasionally have someone to talk to. He hadn't reckoned on missing that. For much of the day, he was content to be alone, tramping through the woods or sitting on the bank of the creek dangling his fish line. He was like his father in that. But there were times when he thought he would like to share it with someone, with anyone, even his sister Sarah, though he never paid much mind to her at home. So he was not as quick-witted as he should have been when unexpectedly someone arrived. He was sitting on the flat stone that served as a doorstep, waiting for his supper to cook. The late sun slanted in long yellow bars across the clearing. The forest beyond was already in shadow. Matt was feeling pleased with his day. That morning he shot a rabbit. He had skinned it carefully, stretching the fur against the cabin wall to dry. Chunks of the meat were boiling now in the kettle over the fire, and the good smell came through the door and made his mouth water. In the dimness of the trees, a darker shadow neared. This time it didn't disappear, but came even nearer. He could hear the crackle of twigs under heavy boots. Matt leaped to his feet. Pa? No answer. It wasn't his father, of course. It couldn't be. An Indian? Matt felt a curl of alarm against his backbone, and he stood, his muscles tensed. The man who came tramping out of the trees was not an Indian. He was heavy-set, the fat bulging under a ragged blue army coat. His face was almost invisible beneath a tangle of reddish whiskers. Halfway across the clearing, he stopped. Howdy, he called. Hello, Matt said uncertainly. Was this someone who ought to be greeted like a deacon? The stranger came nearer so that Matt could see the small blue eyes that glittered in the weather-hardened face. The man stood, deliberately taking his time, looking over the cabin and the cornfield. Nice place you've got here. Matt said nothing. The man peered curiously over Matt's shoulder through the open door. He could easily see that the cabin was empty. You all alone here? My father is away just now. Be back soon, will he? I'm going to look something up for a second. How do you think you would act? Huh? If you were home alone for 7 weeks and somebody just showed up. Matt was puzzled by his own unwillingness to answer. He ought to be glad to see anyone after all these days alone, but somehow he wasn't. He didn't quite know why he found himself lying. Any time now, he said. He went back to the river to get supplies. He might be back tonight. When I saw you coming, I thought it was him. I guess I surprised you. I reckon you don't get much company way off here. No, we don't, Matt said. Then your pappy wouldn't want you to turn away a visitor, would he? I thought maybe you'd ask me to stay for supper. I got a whiff of it a half a mile off. Of course, he said. Come in, sir. The man snorted. Ben's my name. You may have heard of me in the river town. We didn't stay in that town very long, Matt said. He hurried to light a candle. The stranger stood inside the door, taking in every inch of the small room. Your pappy knows how to build a good, tight house, he said. You reckon on staying here for good? It's our land, Matt told him. In the candlelight, the room looked snug and homey, something to be proud of showing off to a stranger. My mother and sister will be coming soon. More folks coming all the time, the man said. Time was you could tramp for a month and never see a chimney. Now the towns are spreading out from the river every which way. His eye fell on the rifle hanging over the door. He let out a long, admiring whistle and walked over to run his hand along the stock. Mighty fine piece, he said. It's worth a passel of beaver. My father wouldn't sell it, Matt said shortly. He was busying himself now to make the stranger welcome. He scooped out a good measure of flour, stirred in some water, patted the dough on a clean ash board, and propped it up in front of the fire to bake. He laid out 2 bowls on the table and 2 pewter spoons. He poured molasses into 1 pewter dish. Then he ladled the hot stew into the bowls. The way that stew disappeared, the stranger couldn't have eaten a meal in a good while. Matt took a very small share for himself. He pulled back his hand and watched the man snatch the last bit of corn cake, sopping at the last of the molasses with it. Finally, Ben pushed back his stool and drew his hand across his beard. That was mighty tasty, son, mighty tasty. You wouldn't have a mite of tobacco now, would you? I'm sorry, Matt said, but my father doesn't have any. Pity, it can't be helped, I suppose. In the easy silence that followed, Matt decided to ask a question of his own. Are you traveling to the river? Ben snorted. Not likely. I'm keeping as far off from that river as I can till things quiet down. Matt waited. Tell the truth, I get away from that town just in time. Weren't nothing they could prove, but they sure had it in for me. So I said, Ben, you plan on getting yourself some beaver pelts, and it looks like now is the time to get moving. I aim to settle in with the Indians a bit and maybe move on the north. You mean you're going to live with them? Could do worse. I can bed down just about anywhere. It certainly looked as though, invited or not, Ben was planning on bedding down right there in the cabin. He eased himself off the stool, sprawled out on the floor, his shoulders propped up against the wall. He pulled a dirty corncob pipe from his pocket and stared at it ruefully. Pity, he said. Meal like that needs tobacco to settle it right. He put the pipe away and shifted his heavy bulk against the wall. When I was not more than your age, he drawled, well fed and ready to talk, I spent a whole winter with the Indians. Hunt with them, trap with them, easy to pick up their lingo, and I still remember a good bit of it. But this country isn't the same anymore. You got to go west, Ohio maybe, to get any decent trappings. The Indians still hunt here, don't they? Matt asked. The Indians have mostly cleared out these parts, Ben said. What wasn't killed off in the war got taken with sickness, and a good deal of them moved on to Canada, and what's left make a mighty poor living. The game is getting so scarce. Where do they live? Roundabout, Ben waved vaguely toward the forest. They make small camps for a while and then move on. The Penobscots stick like burrs. They won't give up. They still hunt and trap. No way to stop them. Never got it through their heads that they don't still own the land. You've never seen them? My father did once. Do they speak English? Enough to get what they want. They pick it up from the traders. What pelts they can scrape together, they take into the towns. They can strike a pretty sharp deal. You've got to know how to handle them. The reason ain't seen, he said. They got enough sense to clear out of these parts when the bugs are bad. They move off, the whole lot, down to the coast to get their year's mess of clams. Should be moving back about now. They'll stay the summer and then go off for a big hunt come the fall. Those hunts are nothing like nowadays. Bows and arrows was all they had. Still, some of them use them. They can't get their hands on a gun. I got so I was darn near as good as any of them. I don't suppose I could hit a barn door now. Ben's voice drawled on, thickened with food and drowsiness. He told of the big moose hunts of his days. He fought in the recent war against the French and despised them for stirring up the Indians against the main settlements. He seemed to have single-handedly shot down half of the French army. Especially he hated the Jesuit priests who egged the Redskins on, and he had once been part of an expedition that broke into a chapel and smashed the popish idols. Once he had taken captive by the fierce Iroquois who set on putting him to torture, but he had been too smart for them and escaped in the night. The man's voice was trailing off, and he slumped lower and lower. Presently, he was sprawled flat on the floor, snoring. It was clear enough that he could bed down anywhere. At least he hadn't taken over Matt's bed. Matt moved about quietly, though he doubted anything could disturb his guest. He cleaned off the bowls with a twig brush, he banked the fire with ashes, and finally he settled down on a hemlock mattress. But he couldn't sleep. He lay staring up at the log roof, even after the last flickers of firelight had died away and the cabin was in darkness. He couldn't quiet his uneasy thoughts. Bragging about his adventures by the fire, Ben just seemed like a harmless, fat, tired old man. But to be honest, Matt enjoyed his company, but now he began to worry. How long was Ben going to stay? He was sure to find out soon that Matt was living alone, and when he did, would he decide it was more comfortable here than in an Indian village? At the rate he wolfed down that supper and the flour, the molasses wouldn't hold out long. Would he expect Matt to go on providing meals and waiting on him? And why had he left that town on the river in such a hurry? Was there a charge against him? Was he dangerous? Perhaps even a murderer? At that thought, Matt sat up in his pine bed. It would be sensible to stay awake and on guard. He had half a mind to fetch down his father's rifle and keep it near at hand, but then he felt ashamed. What would his father say about begrudging a stranger a meal and a night's rest? All the same, he was determined not to shut his eyes that night. He kept them open for a long time. But suddenly he jerked out of a deep sleep and saw the daylight was streaming across the cabin floor. The cabin door was open and the man was gone. Perhaps he only stepped outside. Matt stumbled to the door. No sign of the stranger. Relief flooded over him. All that worrying, and the man had never intended to stay. Perhaps he had actually believed that lie that Matt's father was returning. And then once again, Matt felt ashamed. He must only made it too plain that Ben wasn't welcome. At that moment, Ben might appear hungry for breakfast, and he better stir up a fresh corn cake. It was then that he noticed his father's rifle was not hanging over the door. In a panic, he searched the cabin, his own bed, the corner shelves, under the table, and the stools. He rushed back to the door and onto the edge of the forest. It was no use. No way of telling which way the man had taken, or how long he had been on his way while Matt slept. Ben was gone, and so was the rifle. He should have kept it in his hands, as his hunch had warned him, and he could see now that the man had his mind set on that gun from the moment he laid eyes on it. But even if Matt had had it in his hand, could he have held out against those burly arms? And to keep that gun, could he have shot a man, even a criminal? It was only later, when his rage began to die down, that he felt a prickle of fear. Now he had no protection and no way to get meat. Sick with anger, he sat staring at his row of notched sticks. It would be a month at least before his father returned, a month of nothing but fish. And what would his father say? Chapter 4. It was hard to be deprived of the hunting. Now, whenever he went into the forest, the squirrels and the rabbits frisked about boldly, knowing perfectly well he had no gun in his hands. Once he was certain he could have got a good shot at a deer. Instead, he went fishing. He knew he ought to be grateful that the creek and the pond could provide all the food he needed, even though the fish didn't seem to stick to his ribs like a good stew. Here and there, in a sunny spot, he discovered a patch of blueberries. Gradually, his spirits rose again. The July weather was perfect. The flies and mosquitoes were less bothersome. He began to count the days ahead instead of the ones he had already notched. 2 or 3 more sticks and his family would be there. The corn was growing taller. The little green, hard pumpkins were rounding out, and he could wait a little longer. Perhaps he even became a mite careless. He had been fishing all one morning, a good clear day, the water still a little nippy on his ankles and the sun warm on his head. He came whistling out of the woods, swinging 4 trout. He quieted down all of a sudden when he heard a cackling in the underbrush ahead. The door was swinging open at a crazy angle, and one hinge was broken. Across the windowsill, some white stuff dribbled like spilled flour. With a shout, he dropped his fish and ran. It was flour, tracked all over the cabin floor. The sack ripped open and dragged across the room. The cabin was a shambles. The stools overturned, the shelf swept bare, the precious molasses keg upside down on the floor and empty. Ben must have come back. For a moment, hot sparks of anger drove every sensible thought out of his head. Then he knew it couldn't have been Ben. Ben was too fond of food to waste it. Indians? No, it wasn't possible any human being would scatter food like this. And with a sinking heart, he knew what happened. He remembered the thrashing in the underbrush. It had to be a bear. Somehow he neglected to bar the door securely. Well, the damage was done. The bear would be a half a mile away by now. Helpless with fury at his own carelessness, he stood for some time in the middle of the cabin, unable to pull his wits together. Then he went down on his hands and knees and carefully began to scrape up traces of flour. After a time, he gave up. The best he managed to salvage was 2 handfuls of a gritty, unappealing meal, even though he had took the good pewter spoon and dug into the hollows of the dirt floor. After a long time, he felt hungry enough to remember the fish. Half-heartedly, he cleaned them and blew the fire and roasted them. He found a few grains of salt left in the tin to sprinkle on them. He would have to make the best of it. He wouldn't starve as long as he had a fish line, but tomorrow he wouldn't even have any salt. Chapter 5. Day after day, he kept remembering the bee tree. He and his father had discovered it weeks ago. High in a tree at the swampy edge of the pond they had called Loon Pond, the bees were buzzing in and out of an old woodpecker hole. Matt had thought they were wild bees, but his father said no, there were no bees at all in America till the colonists brought them from England. That's not true. This swarm must have escaped from one of the river towns. Bees were better left alone, Pa said. He felt he could scarcely endure another meal of plain fish. He was hungry for something tasty. Knowing so well his fondness for molasses, his mother had persuaded them to carry that little keg all the way to Maine, when his father would have rather gone without it. She would have smiled to see him running his finger around and around the empty keg like a child licking up the last drop that the bear had missed. Now he couldn't stop thinking about that honey. It would be worth a sting or two just to have a taste of it. There couldn't be much danger in going up that tree and taking just a cupful, perhaps. And one morning he made up his mind to try. It was an easy tree to climb, the branches as neatly placed as the rungs of a ladder. The bees did not seem to mind as he pulled himself higher and higher. Even when his head was on a level with the hole, they flew lazily in and out, not paying him any mind. The hole was small, not big enough for his hand and the spoon to be brought in with him. Peering, he could glimpse far inside a golden mass of honeycomb. The bark all around the hole was rotted and crumbling. Cautiously, he put his fingers on the edge and gave a slight tug. A good piece of bark broke off in his hand, and with it came the bees. With a furious buzzing, they came pouring from the broken hole. The humming grew like a roar, like a great wind. Matt felt a sharp pain on his neck, then another and another. The angry creature swarmed along his hands and bare arms, in his hair, on his face. How he got down off that tree, he will never remember. Water. If he could reach water, he could escape them. Bellowing and waving his arms, he plunged towards the pond. The bees were all around him. He could not see through the thick, whirling cloud of them. The boggy ground sucked at his feet. He pulled 1 foot clear out of his boot and went stumbling over sharp roots and flung himself in. His foot caught in a fallen branch and he wrenched it clear. Dazed with pain, he sat down into the icy shelter of the water. He came up choking. Just above the water, the angry bees circled. Twice more he ducked his head and held it down until his lungs were bursting. He tried to swim out of the pond, but his feet were tangled in jagging weeds. When he tried to jerk them free, a fierce pain ran up his leg and he went under again, thrashing his arms wildly. Then something lifted him. His head came up from the water and he gulped air into his aching lungs. He felt strong arms around him. Half conscious, he dreamed that his father was carrying him, and he did not wonder how this could be. Presently, he knew he was lying on dry ground. Though his eyelids were swollen almost shut, he could see 2 figures bending him over, unreal, half-naked figures with dark faces. Then, as his wits began to return to him, he saw that they were Indians, an old man and a boy. The man's hands were reaching for his throat, and in a panic, Matt tried to jerk away. Not move, the deep voice ordered. Bee needles have poison, must get out. Matt was too weak to struggle. He could not even lift his head. Now that he was out of the cold water, his skin seemed to be on fire from head to toe, yet he could not stop shivering. He had to lie helpless while the man's hand moved over his face and neck and body. Gradually, he realized they were gentle hands, probing and rubbing at one tender spot after another, and his panic began to die away. He still could not think clearly. Things seemed to keep fading before he could grasp them. He could not protest when the man lifted him again and carried him like a baby. It did not seem to matter where they were taking him, but shortly he found himself lying on his own bed in the cabin. He was alone. The Indians were gone. He lay too tired and too sore to figure out how he came to be there, knowing only that the nightmare of the whirling bees and choking water was past, and he was safe. Some time passed. Then once again the Indian was bending over him, holding a wooden spoon against his lip. He swallowed in spite of himself, even though he found out it was not food but some bitter medicine. He was left alone again, and presently he slept. Chapter 6. I guess I'll read this first 6 chapters and we'll call it all good. Finally, Matt woke and knew that he was well. His body was no longer on fire. He could open his eyes. He saw that sunlight glinted through the chinks in the roof. All his familiar things were around him, the shelves with the pewter dishes, his jacket hanging on a peg. He felt as though he had been on a long journey and had come home. He must have slept through half a day and a night. When the cabin door opened, the Indian entered, and Matt pulled himself up. Now, with clear eyes, he saw that there was nothing in the least strange about this man. He was not dressed so differently from Matt's own father, in a coat of some rough brown cloth and leggings fringed down the side. His face was smooth shaven, and so was his whole head, except for one long black topknot. When he saw that Matt was awake, his stern face lighted with a wide smile. Good. It was a half word, half grunt. White boy very sick, now well. Matt remembered his father's advice. Good morning, he said respectfully. The Indian pointed a hand at his own chest. Sackness, family of Beaver, he said. He seemed to be waiting. I'm Matt Hollowell, Matt answered. Good. White men leave you here. Just for a while, Matt told him. He has gone to get my mother. It did not occur to him to lie to this old man as he had to Ben. Moreover, he knew that there was something that he had to say, and he tried to find the right words. I'm grateful to you, he finally said. It was a very lucky thing that you happened to find me. We watch. White boy very foolish to climb bee tree. So he had been right, Matt thought, that those eyes were watching him from the forest. He was sure that the Indian had not asked him where he lived. They had brought him straight home to his cabin. Even though he knew it was good fortune that they had been watching him, he still felt somehow resentful of their spying. Abruptly, he swung his feet to the floor and winced as a sharp pain ran up his leg. The Indian noticed, moving closer, and took Matt's ankle between his hands and pressed gently with his fingers. Is it broken? Matt asked. No, not broke. Mend soon. Sleep now. Not need any more medicine. The Indian had put something on the table as he came in, and when he was gone, Matt hobbled over to see what it was and found a wooden bowl of stew, thick and greasy, flavored with some strange plant, wonderfully filling and strengthening. With it, there was a cake of cornbread, coarser than his own, but delicious. The next day, the Indian brought the boy with him. Niquenis, you call grandson, he announced, a teen. The two boys stared at each other. The Indian boy's black eyes held no expression whatever. Unlike the old man, he was naked except for a breechcloth held up by a string at his waist. It passed between his legs and hung down like a little apron in the front and the back. His heavy black hair fell straight to his shoulders. A teen, same winter as White Boy, maybe, the man asked. He held up 10 fingers and then 4 more. I'm 13, Matt answered, holding up his own fingers. At least he excused himself that he would be in another week. The Indian boy did not speak a word. Quite plainly, he had been brought here against his will. He stared around the cabin and seemed to despise everything he saw. He made Matt feel like a fool, sitting with his leg propped up on a stool. Matt steadied himself on a good leg and stood up. Now he noticed that Sackness was holding out to him a rough sort of a crutch. Matt wished he did not have to try it right now, with both of them watching him, but he could see the man expected it. He managed a few steps, furious at his own clumsiness. He had never imagined how pesky a crutch could be. Moreover, although there was not the slightest change in the boy's face, Matt was sure that Atine was laughing at him. There was a nasty little gleam in the boy's eye. The moment they were gone, he seized the crutch in earnest, and very soon he could swing himself along at a pretty good pace. Now he was able to get on outside the cabin to check the corn patch and bring in firewood. The trouble was he only had one boot. The woolen stocking his mother had knit for him was wearing thin, and on the rough ground it wore through in no time. This, too, the Indian noticed when he came with his grandson the next morning. No boot, he said. I lost it, Matt answered. Sorry. It came off in the mud when I ran, and once again he felt ridiculous under the black boy's stares. 3 days later, Sackness brought him a pair of moccasins. They were handsome and new, of moose hide, dark and glistening with grease, tied with stout thongs that were strong enough to wrap around his ankle. Beaver woman make, Sackness said. Better than white man's boots. White boy will see. He took off his one boot and slipped on the moccasin. Indeed, they were better. In fact, they were wonderful. Not stiff like new leather boots, not knobby or pinching anywhere, light as nothing at all when he lifted his feet. No wonder Indians did not make a sound when they walked in the forest. Shame suddenly flooded Matt. This man had perhaps saved his life, had come bringing food in a crutch, and now these beautiful moccasins. It wasn't enough to say an awkward thank you. He needed to give him something in return, not money. There were a few silver coins in the box, but something made him feel sure that he could not offer money to this proud man, and he looked about in despair. There was almost nothing of his own in the cabin. He spied the 2 books on the shelves, the only 2 his father had been able to carry into the wilderness. One was the Bible, and he dared not give away his father's Bible. The other book was his own, the only one he had ever possessed, Robinson Crusoe. He had read it a dozen times and thought of parting with it the thought of parting with it was painful, but it was the only thing he had to give. He hobbled across the room and took it down from the shelf and held it out to the Indian. Sackness stared at it. It's for you, Matt said. It's a gift. Please take it. Sackness reached out and took the book in his hand. He turned it over and over slowly, his face showing not any sign of pleasure. Then he opened it and stood peering at the page. With shame, Matt saw that he was holding it upside down. He couldn't read. Of course he couldn't. Matt should have known that. He made a terrible mistake and embarrassed the good man. He had heard once that the one thing an Indian could never forgive was a hurt to his pride, and he felt his own face burning. But Sackness did not look embarrassed. His dark stare went from the book to Matt's face. White boy know signs, he asked. Matt was puzzled. White boy read what white men write here? Yes, Matt admitted. I can read it. For a long moment, the Indian studied the book. Then astonishingly, that rare white smile flashed. Good, he said. Sackness make treaty. A treaty, Matt said. Niquenis hunt, bring white boy bird and rabbit. White boy teach Atine white man signs. You mean I should teach him to read? Good. White boy teach Atine what books say. Doubtfully, Matt looked from the old man to the boy who stood listening. His heart sank. The scorn in the boy's face had turned to black anger. Nada, No, he said no. The furious word exploded, the first word Matt had ever heard him speak. Under his breath, he muttered a string of incomprehensible words. His grandfather's stern face did not change. He was undisturbed by the boy's defiance. A teen learn, he said. White men come more and more to Indian land. White men not make treaty with pipe. White men make signs on paper. Signs Indians not know. Indians put mark on paper to show friend of white man, then white man take land. Tell Indian cannot hunt on land. A teen learn to read white man's signs. A teen not give away hunting grounds. The boy glowered at his grandfather, but he did not dare speak again. With a black scowl, he stalked out of the cabin. Good, said Sackness. He handed the book back to Matt. A teen comes Seba tomorrow. Chapter 7. All right, so I will stop here. And that is all. So, I have the Study Island lesson, which is the research that we didn't do. Remember, I told you that we were going to learn how to write a bibliography and how to do research. So there's that on Study Island. There's also a journal, which I'm going to figure out how to put the assignment up on Facebook. And if I can do it on Instagram. And if you have it, share it with people. I sent out an email and a text to as many parents that I had, but I don't know if you got it or not. This is very hard to do. It's hard to teach via a computer. Maybe you should all come sit in my front yard, 6 feet apart, and I will stand on my driveway. I miss you guys awfully. I am sad and lonely, and I miss school very, very much. But, oh well. Can't do anything about it. If you need me, call me. My phone number was on the board for the entire year of school, but I bet only 4 of you have it. My phone number is 908-892-1106. Do not text me or call me after 10 o'clock at night, even though I will probably be up because it will make me nervous that something is wrong. And do not text me or call me before 9 o'clock in the morning because I don't like morning. And I will be sleeping. And then I will be mad too because I will worry that something is wrong. All right? Be careful out there. Be safe. Stay home. Stay away from crowds of people. All right? Good. I love you. See you later, alligator. See you tomorrow at 7 o'clock. I don't know where this button is to make it be not live anymore. I'm assuming it's here. Let me see. I don't know. There it is. End stream. All right. Good night. See you tomorrow.